Welcome everyone to this module, Catholicism and Culture, Tools for Transformational Faith-Based Educational Leadership, what I have termed TF-Bel in diverse communities. I'm so excited to be here with you. My name is Father Stan Chu Ilo, and I'm so happy to belong to this cohort. So for this presentation, we will look at the objectives of this module, then Vatican II or Second Vatican Council and the birth of world Catholicism, foundations of Catholicism and culture, features of Catholicism and culture, and cultural inclusive and equity education, Catholic inclusive and equity education, CIEE, the challenges and the opportunities, and embracing a transformational faith-based educational leadership, TF-Bel, and then some of the competencies that I will share with you for TF-Bel, cultural competencies like knowing, doing, and changing, and then some concluding remarks. So let's go to the objectives of this module. My hope is that at the end of this presentation, students will gain an understanding of cultural diversity in the church and in the world, understand some of the social drivers of change in the world, evaluate how these social drivers challenge Catholic educational leadership, and develop tools for addressing the challenges and opportunities of cultural diversity in faith-based education through cultural competence. We're just going to pause here. So first, cultural smart global citizen. That's what we need in the world today. Psychologists have given us the concept of intelligence as the ability to reason. This ability can be measured through what we call intelligence quotient, IQ. More recently, there is a greater recognition of other forms of intelligence, like multiple intelligence, a recognition of emotional intelligence, that is how we handle our emotions, social skills, social awareness, self-regulation. The measure of emotional intelligence is called emotional quotient, EQ. Researchers are also developing different approaches to managing cultural differences and cultural diversity and inclusion in the world, and how to acquire the knowledge and skills of cultural proficiency. So the goal of this presentation is to help participants and students to develop cultural intelligence. That is the ability which everyone who lives in a globalized and pluralistic world of today needs in order to function effectively in his or her interaction with other people from different cultures. Anyone who wishes to function as an effective and transformational educator these days must become culture smart. This is so important, particularly in faith-based settings. So Christianity, I like to use the analogy of a rainbow with many colors. I think one signet fact that I wish to state at the beginning of this presentation is one that is pretty obvious. That is, first, Christianity cannot be exclusively linked with one particular culture: Jewish, Greek, Asian, American, African, Latino, or Western. Every culture is potentially a carrier of the story of Jesus. Therefore, from its very beginnings, the Christian message was communicated by using concepts from recipient cultures. In order to establish a meaningful communication, the message was to be shaped in the language, the images, and concepts of the recipient culture. Thus, the story of Jesus, which began in a Jewish environment, spread to Africa, Middle East, Rome, and Hellenistic worlds, the Celtic and Germanic worlds, but also to India, China, Australia, and so on. In every culture and every age, Christianity adapts itself to its milieu because, as the document of the Second Vatican Council called Gaudium et Spes says, Christ unites himself with all human beings and all human cultures. And this unity is from within the heart of that culture. And I like to quote Gaudium et Spes, number 53, because it kind of gives us a foundation or an entry into what I want to talk about, the recognition of cultural diversity. And the bishops who gathered in Rome said, and I quote, "Thence it follows that human culture has necessarily a historical and social aspect, and the word culture also often assumes a sociological and ethnological sense. According to this sense, we speak of a plurality of cultures. Different styles of life and multiple scales of values arise from the diverse manner of using things, of laboring, of expressing oneself, of practicing religion, of forming customs, of establishing laws and juridic institutions, of cultivating the sciences, the arts, and beauty. Thus, the customs handed down to it form the patrimony proper to each human community. It is also in this way that there is formed the definite historical milieu which enfolds man of every nation and age, and from which he or she draws the values which permit him or her to promote civilization." And I like to talk about Catholicism and culture really from what happened between 1962 and 1965, the greatest coming together of Catholic leaders from all over the world to look at the church in the modern world. And you see the procession at the beginning of that very epochal event that reshaped and redefined modern Catholicism. So really in theological language and often in sociology of religion, people talk about the emergence of world Catholicism or world Christianity. And what does that mean? Simply that in the past, the heartland of Christianity was in the West, in Europe, and the rest of the global South, Asia, Latin America, Middle East, Africa, were regarded as the margins. But however, the center of gravity is shifting now. Now, whereas we are witnessing the sunset, if you like, of Christianity in the heartland of Christianity in the Western world, we are seeing an exponential growth in Christianity in the rest of the world outside of the West. So what it means is that the old maps of Christianity can no longer function. We now have new maps. The new features of Christianity in different parts of the world outside the West are the things that are defining the shape and texture of modern Christianity. So when Eusebius, the famous Christian historian, began to write about the history of the church, he talked about Christianity not being a historical subject because they understood Christianity as a homogeneous, monolithic culture. And then we think of Hegel, who wrote his famous or infamous cartography of world history, where he didn't even include Africa in his map, because for him, the history of the world is Europe, and the movement of the spirit, the world spirit, is fulfillment or is it came to its height in the West. So now we're moving away from church history simply as what Europeans did in in the rest of the world, European notions of God, European notions of doctrine. We're moving now to what we call mission history, where the emphasis is really not on a particular cultural expression as an absolute model that other cultural expressions have to embrace, but rather where the accent is on God. And God can assume in every culture, in every person, in every race, a certain incarnation, so that that race, that culture, that person mediates God. And this is also very important if we look at global history, the history of colonialism and the destruction of other people's culture, the imposition of Western types of knowing, epistemology, Western politics, Western economic skills upon the rest of the world. So by the end of the Second World War, the cup of horror was overflowing. And that was what sociologists will call the third wave historical sociology, when people began to question grand narratives of history, grand narratives of faith, to start to pay more attention to contextual, local knowledge, local expressions of faith, and also local wisdom, indigenous wisdom. So that's how the movement was made from world mission, that is converting the West and converting the rest according to the Western tenets of Christianity, the Western tenets of democracy or neoliberal capitalism, to what we call world Christianity, the recognition of cultural pluralism within Christianity and in the world. And I think some of the scholars that help us to understand this is Karl Rahner, the German theologian, very influential theologian, who began to use the word world church. He says that what Vatican II brought to Christianity and Catholicism actually was that it moved away from being a Western church to being a world church. And these have implications. Now, in Latin America, it led to the emergence of liberation theology, the Church of the Poor movement, where people began to question structures and systems of oppression. People began to understand that poverty is not natural. Poverty is as a result of a combination of factors. And so when you analyze power dynamics, then you ask whose interest is being served, who is benefiting from the system. And then you start to see that the dream of God for a better world is really different from a lot of these structures and systems: neoliberal capitalism, colonialism, racism, sexism, and all those isms that continue even today to destroy human rights, human freedom, and the full flourishing of everyone. And within that time, you can think of post-colonialism movement, civil rights movement, immigration reform in the United States, and then Cold War that emerged, the battle between the East and the West, and social upheavals in the global South as a result of newly independent countries and nations were struggling to piece their units together. So the famous African novelist Chinua Achebe captures this in the book titled Things Fall Apart. And, you know, Things Fall Apart, I like to cite chapter 10 when Chinua Achebe captures really the tension between the old map and the new map. He says, does the white man understand our custom about land? How can he, when he does not even speak our tongue? But he says that our customs are bad, and our own brothers who have taken up his religion also say that our customs are bad. How do you think we can fight when our own brothers have turned against us? The white man is very clever. He came quietly and peaceably with his religion, We were amused at his foolishness and allowed him to stay. Now he has won our brothers, and our clan can no longer act like one. He has put a knife on the things that held us together, and we have fallen apart. So really, I want to use that things fall apart as the analogy of what is happening in the world, and especially after the Second Vatican Council. You know, I quote William Butler Yeats' poem here: turning and turning in the widening gyre, the falcon cannot hear the falconer, things fall apart, the center cannot hold, mere anarchy is loosed upon the world. So really, it's about the problem of one and many. How can we live together? Now, the former chief rabbi of London, Jonathan Sachs, in a very, very powerful book, The Dignity of Difference, How to Avoid the Clash of Civilizations, says nothing has proven harder in the history of civilization than to see God or good or human dignity in those whose language is not mine, whose skin is a different color, whose faith is not my faith, and whose truth is not my truth. The truth at the beating of monotheism is that God transcends the particularities of culture and the limits of human understanding. So, can we use one reality to explain all realities? That's the question. Can we use one rule to govern everyone? We know the famous TEDx presentation of Nigerian writer Chimamanda Adichie, The Danger of a Single Story, how we can use our personal story and then try to miniaturize other people's stories, national stories, religious, racial. So really, philosophers tell us something called fallibilism, the sense that our knowledge is imperfect, our cultures, our religions, our identities, the way we construct them are imperfect, they are subject to revision in the face of new evidence. What if my single narrative is wrong? So we can think of American exceptionalism or white supremacy and its associated projects. We can think of colonial attempts to assimilate other people's culture. We can think of indigenous peoples, like Pope Francis reminds us in his post-synodal exhortation on the Amazon about cultural erasures of native people. Now, today we talk about cancel culture by those who want to establish, I call it some form of restorationism. But really, cancel culture, in the way that I translate it originally, is the idea by the West to cancel the cultures of other non-Western subjects, to erase them, to redraw their map of the universe. So the question then is, are there objective truths that can be verified, uninfluenced by human interests, values, and perspectives? So I think when we talk about Catholicism and culture, these are some of the things that face us. First is the difficulty in defining culture. So I'm not going to define culture here. I have already alluded to Gaudium et Spes, but I subscribe to the semiotic notion of culture, particularly the work of Clifford Geertz. You know, he invites us to thick description. So it's better to adopt a more phenomenological analysis, to look at the multiple layers that make up cultures. And these days, we really live in a very intertwined world. We are all in this together. So really describing culture, I think, is a better way than really defining it, because most of us now are hybrids. You know, is a melting pot. Myself, I was born in Nigeria. I studied in Rome. I studied in Paris. I studied in London. I studied in Kenya. I studied in the US. I studied in Canada. That's how I became a global citizen. I'm a priest, Catholic priest. So really, if you want to define stand, how do you do that? So Catholicism, in terms of searching for foundation for Catholicism and culture, where do we find the foundation? It's not simply an attempt at cultural homogeneity or even cultural imperialism. whether in the past, present, and the future. So we must adopt, even for Catholicism, I think, a more descriptive approach in a sociological sense of showing the features of the people, institutions, leadership, and entities that identify themselves as Catholic. So when I use the word Catholicism, it will also include both the hierarchy as well as the rank and file Catholics, Catholic institutions and agencies like schools, hospitals, and social justice ministries. However, Pope Francis really helps me to tell the story of what it means to say that the church is Catholic, which illustrates very well why being Catholic means being open to diversity and inclusion. So Pope Francis captures this well when he said, and I quote, "We cannot demand that peoples of every continent in expressing their Christian faith imitate modes of expression which European nations developed at a particular moment of their history, because the faith cannot be constricted to the limits of understanding and expression of any one culture." Second, he says, church as the home in which the faith is proclaimed in its entirety and the salvation brought to us by Christ is to be offered to everyone. The church is, by its very nature, an open door to all peoples. It's not any person's private property. It's not to be held in prison by any cultural claims. It is the expression of the dream of God to unite and unify and bring together people from all cultures, races, language, and nations. The church is not a group of elites. She does not concern only the few. The church has no limits. She is present to the totality of people, to the totality of the human race. This is an amazing thing Pope Francis captures here. So the one church is present even in the smallest parts. The smallest part, every person's life matters. Every culture matters, especially those who are on the margins, those who are suffering. So I like the image of the great orchestra with many parts that Pope Francis uses. He says, this is a beautiful image, illustrating that the church is like a great orchestra in which there is a great variety. We are not all the same, and we do not all have to be the same. We are all different, varied, each of us with our own spiritual qualities. And this is the beauty of the church, Pope Francis says. Everyone brings their own gift which God has given for the sake of enriching others. And between the various components, there is diversity. However, it is a diversity that does not enter into conflict and opposition. It is a variety that allows the Holy Spirit to blend it into harmony. This is very beautiful. So what then is culture? I think people tend to communicate their cultural identity to others in the broadest possible ways. You know, by the way you talk, by the way you dress. We are all socialized into a certain cultural way. Cultures, however, can be a prison. Like you can get imprisoned in your own culture. And then you close your mind. And then you close yourself to the possibility of embracing beauty. Culture can be a palace, where you are comfortable, where you can roam about, where you feel at home. So we are multicultural in nature because our cultural identity is not fossilized, is dynamic, is always changing. However, though culture changes, it has some patterned and strong component which does not easily change. So interacting with other cultures is a good way to understanding other cultures, as well as a good way of understanding your own culture. Because the Canadian philosopher and theologian Bernard Lonergan uses that concept, say clarification by contrast. When you put my own culture with your own culture, then I can see the strengths and weaknesses of my own culture by looking at the other person's culture. We judge behaviors according to context, and this is very important because we see things normally from our own cultural perspective. That's what philosophers call perspectivism. So that really helps anyone who wants to be an educational leader to know that your knowledge is limited, that your vision is limited, and that opens you up. That's what education does. It helps you to read. It helps you to dialogue. It helps you even to die to yourself, to die to your selfishness, to die to your prejudice, and then you don't replicate that in other people. So you become somehow a transformed person, always transforming others. So it's an invitation then to talk about culture, that a multicultural perspective can help us to establish common grounds, even as we educate people in Catholic education. So I've given you here, Hofstede's cultural dimension theory. I'm not going to detain you with this, but it kind of gives us some categories to look at how different cultures can be viewed: power, distance, individualism, masculinity, uncertainty, avoidance, long-term orientation. So it's very important to look at this, but it's something I want you to read further. We go to the next point here. What he means by these categories, power, distance, I just use that as an example, the degree to which society accepts that power is distributed equally. You find some cultures where women are oppressed. You find some other cultures that are making conscious effort to establish equality, gender equality. You find some cultures where people defer to authorities in an unquestioning ways. You find some cultures where people challenge authority. So whatever it is, you can look at different cultures from the perspective of power. How do they look at the future? How do they interpret risks? Are they individualistic, people mind your own business, or are they collectivist, and where people are thinking of some common identity, some community-based approaches and interactions? And like I can say, like growing up in the village in my home, if someone doesn't have oil or salt, they don't need to make an appointment to come. They just walk in and say, Mama Stan, do you have oil? You don't wait. It's you have to RSVP for a party, say a wedding. People just show up and you welcome them. So these are some ways of one can look at different kinds of cultures. So in Catholicism, I think we can look at the foundations of Catholicism and culture. One is what I call the divine economy and the divine pedagogy. The Greek word here is synkatabasis. The word synkatabasis translates divine accommodation. So the divine economia, that is, how does God share and distribute blessings? God gives freely to everyone. God does not wait for us to have our acts together before God encounters any of us. And God meets people where they are. To a child who is receiving his or her first Holy Communion, God comes to that child with the mind of a child at his or her level. That's the divine pedagogy. When you are sick, Catholicism and our Christian faith says, God assumes my sickness with me. So somehow, God offers us a model of synkatabasis, how to accommodate ourselves to other people. When you think of it, like Thomas Aquinas says, the character of God, one of the most important character of God, and Bonaventure also agrees with him here, is availability, humility, that God bends down to us. So the second foundation of Catholicism and culture is the Trinitarian origin and destiny of all things, the common origin of all humans and all things. We talk about God as the source of all things. And in that Trinitarian origin, that Trinitarian heart, what do we have? We have diversity of operation. God, the Father, Son, Holy Spirit, different but related. They're friends, they commune together, they enjoy each other. The Greek word here used of that relationship is perichoresis. It's a sacred dance. They dance so together. They are different, but they dance so intimately, so closely that it is hard to to differentiate who is dancing, who steps, because they work together in solidarity, respect, love, collaboration, participation, and subsidiarity. They support each other. And that's the basis, Second Vatican Council tells us, of diversity and Catholicity. The basis and foundation of accepting everyone and respecting everyone's uniqueness is the Trinity. And then we have the Pentecost experience, that great experience when we heard in the Acts of the Apostles, everyone from different language, race, people, nations, they all gathered together, they spoke, and everyone understood. What was the language they spoke? Some say they spoke the language of love. People understand love. Everyone understands the language of love. Students will understand the language of love when you speak that. As an administrator, the teachers will understand the language of love. Speak it and they will hear. That's the Pentecost experience. You're building Bethlehem, that place where Jesus was born, everywhere when you speak the language of love. And I think another foundation is the mission Jesus gave us, gave the church. Go out to the whole world. If you got to go out to the whole world to proclaim, teach, save, heal, liberate people, you must assume the chaos of people's lives. You must have boots on the ground. You must be immersed in the context of the people. You must listen to your students. You must pay attention. You must stand on holy ground before them. The other foundation is one world. I mean, COVID has shown us that we live in an interconnected world. We can't do it alone. We need to listen to other people. We need to be concerned about what goes on in other places in the world. One health. It's not just about the health of the human, it's also the health of animals, the health of the sea, the environment, ecological consciousness, one God. There are no 3 or 4 or 5 gods. Everyone, we all worship the same God. We all understand this God differently. That's the basis for human and cosmic flourishing. And so the challenge for us then is, how do you hold, on the one hand, being very different, yet on the other hand, being much alike? So we go to some of the features of modern world that, how do we hold this together? The problem is that today in the world, there's so much poverty. The Catholic social ministry is helping to heal the sick, give food to the hungry, Catholic education. These are all how we try to teach people how to be one and many. When someone walks into a food bank, a Catholic food bank, yeah, you welcome the person. Pandemic and Catholic health. People walk into the hospital today, they're sick, you welcome them. However, there is contestation about Catholic identity between those who are restorationists in their thinking and those who want change. We have problem of leadership across the board. We have the problem of disaffiliation. The young people no longer want to belong to the church in many places. In some places, they are streaming, filling the churches. When you go for the celebration of Our Lady of Guadalupe, most people you see there are not in their 90s and 80s. These are young people. They want something that is exciting, something that is beautiful. The point is that the center of gravity is shifting. So you now have multiple centers of gravity. So it's no longer the Rome that determines everything. Maybe things happening in the payatas, the big slums in Quezon City in Philippines. Maybe the church of the payatas, the church of the dumps, the dump site in Quezon City is where the center of gravity is today. Maybe the people who are drowning in the Mediterranean, that's where the center of gravity is today. And we have contested moral issues today that we must answer through Catholic education about young people who are struggling about their sexual identity, their gender identity, the generation of none, the generation of Z, and many other generation X. Then there is increasing polarization in the church today, not only in the United States, here, all over the world. A lot of contestation. And then politics in the church, and how the church has aligned itself sometimes with political ideologies in the world, different parts of the world, and racism, the original sin we find in the church and in the world. And then violence not only in the church, but also violence and religious persecution against Christians and also against minorities. And intolerance, not only towards Christians, but also Christians who are intolerant of other people's perspectives. And then the shameful aspect of clerical sexual abuse that has shamed all of us and undermined really the message of the gospel. We have issues with gender inequality and patriarchy. You can see signs of toxic masculinity, or what some people have even called acquired narcissistic syndrome. That someone, because you become a priest or you are in authority as a male, some of these syndromes you didn't have before, power corrupts, and then you assume a certain thing that you are not. So the answer, and I'm not trying to absolutize this, the answer to cultural pluralism, all this tension, I think, must be offered through what I call CIEE, Catholic, Inclusive, and Equity Education. And that means we must move beyond consensus or normative cultural approach to a more critical and conflict-based cultural understanding, to move away from metaphysical and apologetic approach. So Catholic education must move away from essentializing to what Gerard Grace, who is the editor of the Journal of Catholic Education, calls roots with openness approach. So you got your roots in those foundations I just mentioned, but open to new insights. We must move away from a closed school culture to an open school culture. So rather than socializing students and administrators into existing ways of thinking, and I'm not saying abandon existing ways of thinking, but rather it enables people to grow and exercise more control over the ways in which they live their lives within their social, communal, and ecological contexts. Really, I frame it in the popular saying, nothing about me without me. Nothing about me without me is a very key principle. Then Christian humanism, the imago Dei, human dignity. We must begin to unpack what this means for us in the world of today. The world where people are suffering because of their social location, because of their gender identity, because of their race, because of their religion, because of their immigration status, which produces this social reproduction, intergenerational poverty. We must, in this light, for a Catholic inclusive and equity education, combat deficit cultural models. Look more into people's social history, their cultural habitus, as they affect the student, the school culture, and the analysis of power differentials. So this approach is a more student-based education that recognizes that contemporary students' attitude towards and experiences of Catholic schooling are no longer homogeneous. And finally, what I call the Eucharistic model. Really, this is what Jesus did at the Last Supper. Everyone was at the table. They shared equally. They participated. So this is against the source message receptor approach, or the banking theory of learning. You know, if you're very popular with most of you. But in missiology, we said we got a source, which the source is the authority that has all the truth and packages this message, and your duty is to receive it. In the Eucharist, we share what we have. So CEIE leads to an accepting community of learners. The model here is the model of friendship. In such a community, everyone is treated as a firstborn child, a sibling, a subject of love, reverence, attention, and respect. This is how we create an empowering school culture. Like was then told me in Toronto, he said, it's not just about what you teach us, it's about the environment, how we feel it, how we feel this environment of love. So I like to quote Parker Palmer here. He says, such a community of love introduces the students in the classroom to a world larger than their own experiences and egos, a world that expands their personal boundaries and enlarges their sense of community. This is why students often describe great teachers as people who bring to life things that the students had never heard of, offering them an encounter with otherness that brings the students to life as well. All students, through a culture of real encounter, enter into a Catholic school where school identity is not simply an essentialized notion of community, but an experiential celebration of the dignity of difference through daily activities and programs that are inclusive in content and shape, and through teachers and pedagogical tools that reflect the particular and bigger world of the learners. Indeed, if I may paraphrase St. Augustine here, the ideal Catholic school culture in such an ideal community of love, nobody deserves to be called a teacher, since we have only one master, and that's Jesus Christ. And in his school, according to St. Augustine, all of us are students. So here we learn with and in the presence of one another. Everyone is teaching and learning at the same time in a real sense. So I have kind of given you now what I've been describing is what I call transformational faith-based educational leadership. I call it education as knowing, doing, and changing. And I'll go quickly through this because it's kind of an educational model that is rooted in the foundation of the Christian memory, but not just the memory of the past, but also memories of today, our encounters. When you meet someone you love, it was a memorable encounter. So every encounter in the school should be memorable. The students want to take this story. That's how the gospel was formed. They were not carrying videos recording Jesus, is what they remember. So what will students remember? What will teachers, fellow teachers remember about you? That's what shapes what they know, what they do, and the skills that they will apply in changing the world. So the Catholic faith-based leader is one that requires not recycling of values, the regurgitation of catechetical texts like some of us, when we were raised Catholics, we were reciting the catechism. It's not the imprisonment to a single narrative of Catholicism, spirituality, or liturgies. Rather, it is spiritual inventiveness and intellectual creativity. In living our gospel-driven values in new ways to reflect changing times, we are bearing witness to the priorities and practices of Jesus Christ and embracing the mission which the Lord has given us to make disciples of all nations through new tools suitable for our times, by daily commitments to our children, to our future, in service characterized by integrity, authenticity, and credibility. This way, we challenge all that is wrong in our churches and wider societies. And we do that as well as inspire practices that help us to reimagine, and I would also add, reimage our today and our future. So I leave you with this very important quote that summarizes everything. TF-Bel is about servant transformational leadership. And in becoming such a transformational leader, it is not about institutional power. It's not about command and control. It is rather shifting authority to those you lead. It means that you value everyone, that you listen more, that you show empathy and unconditional acceptance of others, especially those who are marginal. They have not, are considered not as social deficit, but as equal stakeholders in the life of the organization. Servant leaders are judged to the extent that they have sacrificed their own ego for the collective good, and to the extent that they have succeeded in making their followers servants to the greater good of the community, school, church, and other agencies. I just give you a few lines here as I try to put this all together. TF-Bel is a holistic faith-based educational leadership. It's holistic. And this kind of education happens first through making possible encounter with the person of Jesus Christ as mediated through the educational setting, through the teachers, through the students, the whole school environment. This can be achieved when we are inspired by a spirituality of love, as I have been trying to point out here. And then this spirituality stimulates all members of the school community to do the same, to be loving, to be accepting, to be holistic. Every moment in the school should be animated by a profound encounter with Jesus Christ and with one another as friends. This is really a very important topic, friendship, that Ambrose wrote about in De Officiis, one of the earliest description of Christian friendship by Ambrose. He says, Christian discipleship is all about what? Friendship. And this kind of friendship can then lead to change in behavior, because there is the aspect of what they believe, how they live, their behavior, because they feel a sense of belonging. Everyone is connected. Everyone feels loved. That is the African word that we call Ubuntu. I belong, therefore I am. I am loved, therefore we are. I am related with others, therefore we are. Not just I, me, everyone. Not just my culture, my nation, my money, our cultures, our nations, our world. So here, TF-Bel helps you, these 5 practices: learn to respect others, to serve others, especially the least of the brethren, show justice and fairness, manifest honesty and integrity, and you build a community. That's how you do it. That's how you do it. So I've given also the 3, this you find in most literatures. I can give you some references in the question and answer. Knowledge, mindfulness, and skills. Those 3 represent what I call knowing, doing, and changing. So you know knowledge, you know Jesus, you know your people, you know cultures, you know the world, how the world functions. So you're not ignorant. Mindfulness, then you begin to do what? You begin to apply what you know. You begin to apply it. Do it, do it. This is someone is mindful, is remembering, and then skills. Then you're changing things. So cultural intelligence, that's what I said, knowing, you have to acquire knowledge, you have to be proficient, you must know what culture is, cultural symbols, cultural knowledge, cultural artifacts, behaviors, you must know power differentials, socioeconomic context, and many others, how people construct their social experience. And you become also conscious of the social construction of injustice, inequity, social construction of some of the hierarchies that we have put out there, stratification of human beings and all that. That's very, very important. You cannot change the world if you do not know why the world is wrong. What is wrong with the world? And what is wrong with the world is rooted in cultures, behaviors, and what Pope John Paul II called social sins, social structures, these cultural violence, structural violence against the poor, the weak, and the marginalized. The other point is mindful doing. Mindful doing. How do you abandon your cultural cruise control? Yes, by becoming mindful, connect with people, and always remember that people before you are hurting, they're suffering, they also desire. We know Maslow's hierarchy of needs. We have to fill people's love tank. That's very, very important. We must make common cause with one another through pragmatic solidarity with those who suffer. And then finally, the skills for change. If you want to be a change agent, if you want to change the lives of people, you must first of all change yourself. Change the way you look at the world, change the way you look at people, and believe that a better possible world can come about through your small efforts, small bites. It's not about the best step, but the next step. So I leave you with these principles, to remember culture is a very strong force. That's why we must understand cultures. Otherwise, we will not be effective in education. And there are dominant cultural practices, cultural tendencies, cultural systems that have become settled. Always remember that cultures are human constructions. So if people created them and they become bad, we can unmake them, deconstruct them, and create a better culture for ourselves, for our children, for posterity. And every group has its own cultural challenges, like cultures are prisons and palaces. You must discover your own prison, discover your own palace, and the school becomes a place where we bring all this together. You must widen your impact in the world if you are culture smart. If you're not culture smart, you cannot relate with people. You'll be fighting everywhere. It's also very, very important to recognize our own cultural blinkers and our own limitations. And that's what people mean when they say to step into another person's shoes so you can know what they feel and feel with them. That's compassion. You journey with them. Accompaniment. Accompaniment is not just musical, but it's also when I walk with you, there is a harmony in creation. Accompany one another. That's what TF-Bel says. You cannot change people if you're not accompanying them, if they don't know who you are, if you're not influencing them by the way you love them and care about them. That's what teaching is all about. So the practice is, humility. We all know that. Vulnerable mission, be selfless, service, character, integrity. Develop bias-free practices. It's very hard, but you can overcome your bias. Like Nelson Mandela said, that if people are taught how to hate, how to be mean, they can also be taught how to love, how to be compassionate. That's why people who go to prison, some people come out from the prison, they are better people, reformed. That's really the heart of Catholic education. Catholic intellectual tradition holds the perfectibility of the human person. So human beings are capable of becoming better people. No one is lost. The early church fought against this kind of notion, in different kinds of heresies that say we are damned, we are irremediable, we are so bad that no one is so bad that they cannot change. Otherwise, our education cannot bring change and transformation. So the quote of Henry Nouwen talks about the Christian leader of the future is called to be completely irrelevant. Humility makes us, it's not about you. You stand in the world with nothing to offer, but your own vulnerability. This is the way of Jesus. He came to reveal God's love to us, the great message that we have to carry as ministers of God's word and followers of Jesus is that God loves us, not because of what we do or accomplish, but because God has created and redeemed us in love and has chosen to proclaim that love as the true source of all human life. That's what a teacher is. You are a person who is vulnerable, but also a minister of love. So my final message is my new book, Someone Beautiful to God. I think you are beautiful to God. Everyone is beautiful to God. So I ask you, find beauty in your life. Find beauty in others. Like in this pandemic, with so many people who have died, so much suffering, uncertainty, people lost their job. We've not been together. That human connectivity, alienation. I know a friend of mine whose daughter, 14-year-old, died of suicide during this pandemic. How many people have we lost? So I don't know where you are, but I express my own sympathy if you're hurting right now. So a lot of our young people are hurting. They're looking towards the future. They're looking for hope. And that's why I wrote this book, Someone Beautiful to God. That's you. That's everyone out there, including those who don't love you, who are mean to you. Well, your job as a leader is to be a hope giver, to be a Christ bearer, to be a walking sacrament, or even a walk-in sacrament. You point to something bigger and better. You soar above some of the prevailing negativities in our world, pessimism and cynicism. We need a light, and that light comes from love. It comes from skills. It's not just a wish. Everyone wants to change the world, but you got to get the skills to be a dream maker, to be an architect of a new humanity. And that's what we are called to be. That's what we are called to do, to be the architects of a new humanity. So teaching is a vocation. I happen to come from a family of teachers. Both parents were teachers. My mom taught me in grade 2. So the work you're doing of creating a new humanity, artisans of a better world, is not easy. I hope this presentation can help you to begin to think about this as you continue your journey here at DePaul. Thank you.